Namaste. Welcome, beautiful souls, to Minchiate episode 2. Today is all about the first 5 cards known as the Popes. And I'm hoping to reflect on how to interpret these cards in a reading, or how I would go about that. And some of the things that I've learned from reflecting on the early versus late Minchiate pattern, and some of the fun little things we can add if we are going to bring in the points and aspects of the Minchiate game itself. So a warm welcome to you, and I want to give a shout out, please, to Amparo. So Amparo Aguirre is the creator of Tarot Key Minchiate di Bamarza, which I shared with you in the first episode. And thank you very much to Amparo for sharing the video on your Instagram and commenting below the video. I really appreciate you joining in the conversation. So just lovely to have you here. The deck that I'm working with you didn't see in the first episode is the Minchiate Florentine. This is Los Carabeos. It's from their Anima Antiqua series. And I will be using this one along with the Minchiate El Signo as well too in another as we go forward. So this one is late pattern, and there are some really interesting differences with these cards. The first group of cards, called the Popes, Arcanum 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, are a set of cards in the game of Minchiate that in various combinations score you points. And I think there is something quite significant here in that, as you know, in tarot reading, it is important to formulate a question, as well as we often want to choose a significator, or we want to choose a topic card. And I think these first 5 cards are really important, and maybe ones that you regularly choose as a significator. So I think it's important to understand the energy. Now, what I don't want to do is to bring in contemporary tarot meanings. I really want to sit with and have a good look at these cards and do my very best to reflect on how they may have been seen historically. I also want to remember and honor that this was a game first and foremost, and was not used for divination until later, or at least it wasn't the primary reason for using these cards. So let's look at these one by one. The other deck on the table, which I have really been enjoying the guidebook and taking time to put the translations into a PDF, is Le Tarot Minchiate Restauré by Emmanuel Ige and Isabel Nadolny. I believe I called her Nadolini last week. So this is just a marvelous book, and I have, like I said, really been enjoying reading their reflections on their restored tarot. So this is also early pattern Minchiate, as is the tarot of Bamarzo. When we look at the Magician card, let me zoom in for you. I want to have a look at what is going on in this card. There is a lot of wonder here. The spectators are kind of marveled by what's going on the table. They are even holding on to the arm quite affectionately, it feels like to me, in the early pattern deck. Maybe they are wanting to learn, wanting to understand how maybe their big brother, their uncle, is working at the marketplace, at the carnival. I don't know. I find the relationship between the children and the magician really interesting. And rather than a show, it looks a bit like like I said, some kind of a mentorship. Of course, this is a card that represents fraudulent activity, the con, things like that. But I don't want to necessarily jump to this negative meaning of the card right off hand. The question is very important. And depending on whether you are asking a question about a work situation where you're not sure how people are performing, or whether this is a question about your family relations, I think there's a lot of information that can be gleaned from this particular card. The magician, or Il Bagato, in the late pattern is paying close attention to the children, they look a little older in this particular card. This may be a young adult here, but the magician is really looking towards them, and it almost looks as if he is distracting with left hand and then moving something with the right hand. And so with the magician too, I often think about focus, where to be placing my energy, where to be looking, where to be paying attention. Have I been distracted by something? And I think that's an important question that we can certainly ask with this card. As far as value in a reading, yeah, this is a number one. And just like the tarot that you've been reading for years, this is a number one here as well too. So we know that number ones are important. And it is a card, and there are not many of them, that gives 5 points in the game of Minchiate. It also forms 3 different sets to create even more points in the game. So it's a really important card. The second arcanum is perhaps the most discussed, and I have linked some articles below that if you're interested, you can start reading more about this particular card. The middle card and the one on the right are a queen and an empress. And remember, please, that these cards were never titled on any deck. The names that came to these cards, I'm not sure, actually, it's not really written about how the names came to the cards, because there were never any titles on the cards. I don't think that's really here nor there, but certainly we have a different look to the late Minchiate pattern than the early. In the early pattern, we see a woman. You can definitely see the pregnant belly in the center. And most of the writers talk about the Empress, or the Queen, being one who is most certainly not a ruler. She is the wife of the king, or the wife of the emperor, and her purpose is for the continuity of the royal line. She is there to nurture, she is there to support her partner. And so this role, though she holds the scepter and the orb, though she looks very regal, is certainly symbolic rather than one of power. In the late Minchiate pattern, we have also a rather feminine looking, receptive looking kind of character. And one word that did come to mind was that all of these figures are subordinate to the emperor, to the king. They are not rulers, they are not leaders. And I think that's an important connection here. The appellation, the name of this particular card, is often called the Grand Duke, which is really funny because I'm sure, as you are aware, historically there was no duchy in Italy at that time, Duchy of Florence or Duchy of Tuscany or elsewhere. This name historically doesn't make sense at all. Part of me wonders if in the commissioning of these decks, if there was a family, or there was someone who wanted to have, who wanted to appear in the deck themselves. And this is an interesting reflection because I think about a lot of decks that are created contemporarily. And it's pretty common for deck inspirers, deck creators, to put themselves in their own tarot deck. And so I wonder if it was the Grand Duke or whoever this figure represents, even though he wasn't actually a Grand Duke at that time, maybe he was an aspiring Grand Duke, was indeed the one who commissioned the deck. Or the person who commissioned the deck wanted to recognize this subordinate figure in their life. It's really hard to say. There's also discussion, and you can read all the articles below, about what cards came in and what cards went out. So there's all kinds of possibilities. This is the second arcanum. It's certainly not as powerful as the first or the third, but it is part of these possible combinations of the first 5 cards that are an intrinsic part of the game. And I want to look across these decks at all of the cards, the facings, the positioning of the bodies, and so forth, and I will do that shortly. The third arcanum is the Emperor, and while the late pattern has the Emperor facing in a different direction, I think that we're all fairly familiar with the energy of the Emperor. He is the ultimate ruler. I do really like the red color and the central card behind the Emperor. It's a card of authority, representing one's own sovereignty. And I think this is a card that I'm going to compare them, but I think this is, it's a really strong card. It feels very much like one's sun sign. This is what one stands for. This is how and this is what one operates from. This is a card that I think is very confirming in a reading. It shows that indeed we can do this. We can see something through. We probably have a tremendous amount of backing. It's a big yes card in its positive qualities. And of course, every single card, whether it's tarot or it's Minchiate tarot, is going to have positive and not so positive meanings. Of the first 5 arcanum, I think this one perhaps is the most interesting. And the archetype or the allegory that is represented here is one of, I think, great possibilities that you can, despite all odds, do and become and ascend to something that you, if you put your mind to it, almost never dreamed of. And in this particular card, I believe this one is Popess, this one is Empress of the East, this is Emperor of the East. It also feels like there must have been a tremendous amount of trust to put you into this role. I really like how Amparo has shown this duality with the 2 colors in the background, much like the Popess card or the High Priestess card, where we see the black pillar and the white pillar. We do see the blue of the feminine and the moon, and the bright color of the sun or the solar or the masculine energy. So we're seeing that duality there. We have in this particular card, we have the orb in the right hand, the scepter in the left. The symbol of the star feels like the dominion of the East for sure. And I want to read you a few words from the Minchiate Restore regarding this card here. We stated in the explanation of the Empress that empresses were princesses without power. But this one shows us that there are exceptions. There were great female rulers, for example, Irene of Byzantium, 752 to 803, reigned over the Eastern Roman Empire. She was not content to be merely a wife and mother. She wielded supreme power by assuming the title of Basileus, reserved for the emperor. She almost married Charlemagne, who reigned at the same time, and together they would have been the most powerful couple of their era. It should be noted, however, that the East did not have a monopoly on powerful women. In Europe, for instance, Maria Theresa the Great, sole heir of Emperor Charles VI, was one of the greatest sovereigns of the 18th century, ruling in place of her husband, the pale Francis Stephen of Lorraine. And so I find this particular arcanum very inspiring. It gives me a tremendous amount of optimism. Now, the posture is quite different in early pattern and late pattern. But again, when I'm looking at this card, I'm feeling a very relaxed pose. And there's a sense of cradling of the orb. And in that way, it feels like a very feminine nature, one that matches very closely the cards on the right. And so the question that I want to ask here is, why in the late Minchiate pattern do we put 4 masculine figures in the second, third, and fourth arcanums? I think it's probably had to do with who commissioned the deck, or there may very well be a political reason. And I think it goes without saying that this creates an imbalance in the number of archetypes in the early cards, which can be really important when in a reading we're talking about relationships, when we're talking about balance and so forth. And so just something to note and reflect on is why all of these masculine characters versus in the early pattern having more of a balance between the masculine and the feminine. And like I said, there is most definitely a softness to all of the characters really in the late pattern. And so whether we are defining by gender or even by energy, I think there's a possibility of going in either direction in the late pattern decks. And something else that has caught my eye is that I want to pay attention to the colors of the garments, red and blue and green, and also the way that the orb is being held. It's certainly not being held up on the shoulder, above the shoulder. It's not being held in a place of power. And like I said earlier, it almost feels as if it's being cradled, it's being nurtured. And so in that way, the feminine is certainly represented in these cards. And then we have the card of love, fin amour. And whether this term sounds like a literary term or a perspective on relationship, I think it works in either way. But there is a sense of devotion and commitment, that this isn't a card of lust or mad love. This is a card of commitment and a promise. And I think also in a way represents a bit of a sacrifice in what we are willing to release in order to receive. And I think if you reflect on the piercing of Cupid's arrow, if you reflect on the way that this card is depicted, I think one could say that there is something that we choose to endure for the greater good, and we know that this relationship is going to serve us both in some great way, and we are fully dedicated to this commitment. There is no sense of unhappiness here. There's no sense of forced marriage, and certainly this may be arranged, but yet it still feels very consensual. And above all, perhaps there's a real sense of give and receive. And the principle of reciprocity feels very important here. And in studying this deck, one of the questions that I want to keep asking myself is, why would I choose the Magician or the Empress, Popess, the Empress of the East, as a significator? What would inspire me to choose this particular card as a significator? In understanding that, I think one can really gain a strength in being able to read with a deck such as this. And of course, none of these cards can be read in isolation. We want to be mindful of the surrounding cards. And with the Amour card, it would be wonderful to have the sun be there. And I can feel that the star would certainly bring a lot of positive energy to either the second, third, or fourth arcanum. The Gemini card, I can still see how that would play into the love card. That correspondence would be amazing. Taurus would give us tremendous foundation and wealth, which could be important to the second, third, or fourth. Strength, the maternal energy and the connection to Cancer. So we want to be paying attention to the surrounding cards as far as interpretation goes. However, the gameplay, that is another piece that I am thinking. It's rarely going to happen in a small card reading, so a 2-3 card reading. I don't think this is, it would be a miracle if you got a set of cards. But just so that you are aware, in order to create a set, they need to be sequential. So you could have this particular set here, which is 5-3-3, which creates 11 points. And I think that would be quite auspicious for that to show up in a reading, whether they were touching or not. There's something to be said with the power of this particular intersection. And you might note that the Emperor, and these sets, by the way, have to have at least 3 cards. So the Emperor is going to touch all of these sets. So you could have a combination of 3-4-5 or 2-3-4-5 or 1-2-3-4-5. And so this is though it is not a 5-point card, very important card. And how interesting that not only is this the Emperor, it is the number 3, which is a symbol of growth and power in that way, but it's also the central card of these first 5, and in its ability to create the most combinations. It's quite a card. So I hope that these reflections are helpful, give you some food for thought in your study of the Minchiate. I am by no means an expert. I'm just studying this from the point of view of someone who has been working with the tarot for a long time and really enjoying this, super curious. And as always, I look forward to your feedback, and I will see you in the next episode where I will be discussing the virtues and how we might interpret those 7 cards in a reading. Take good care of yourselves. Namaste.